Thank you so much for coming on. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Tenmann, who is the CTO and co-founder of Science Machine. This is a very special conversation for me because I met Ben before launching Basis to the world, and we had a fantastic discussion at Creandum's Christmas drinks last year, and it just filled me with this sort of electrifying energy that there were people building who saw the world with kind of large overlaps of how I saw the world, and were doing much more exciting things than me. So I'm so delighted to have Ben on today to hear more about where Science Machine is at and how they've been building out, but also to talk to him and hear about how he thinks about the world, because I know it's something that I just find fascinating. So really pleased to have you on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I remember that as well. It was way back in the kind of cold autumn of last year. It was kind of a nice bit of serendipity, I think.
Yeah, and those kind of events, you know, sometimes you get sort of good meetings and sometimes you get great meetings. Perhaps we can start off with the elevator pitch for Science Machine, assuming that the folks sitting at home are coming to this fresh.
Yeah, of course. The super short shtick about what we do is essentially we're building kind of an AI data analyst for the biotech industry. What that means concretely is that you can give basically our AI system some data, research data usually, some maybe genetic data, that sort of thing, and a research question. And then the AI will kind of go away, will analyze it just as a human would, and then comes back with a comprehensive report answering your questions. The purpose of all of this is to allow biotech companies to just reduce the number of experimental cycles and get to market much faster with their drugs. From my own experience, I used to work as like an AI scientist at these biotech companies, but only the very well-funded ones could afford that sort of team. And so we're basically democratizing access to that to smaller biotech companies as well.
I suppose my opening question is, what needs fixing about drugs?
The thing people don't understand is how expensive it is to develop a new drug. Right now, the cost on average for one new drug to market is about $2 billion. And that price is increasing year over year. It's actually getting harder and more expensive to get drugs to market. There's a bunch of reasons for that. But basically, it just takes about 10 years and $2 billion to actually even bring a drug to market in the first place. The reason for it is that we have this very long, very standardized process for how to do it. There's preclinical, which is where you kind of do a lot of early discovery, you design the molecule, you test it on animals, and then you have the clinical phases, 1, 2, and 3. And these phases are where you actually bring it to humans. And at each one of those stages, you basically test for safety and efficacy. And there's then a central regulatory body which will approve your medicine at each one of those stages. So in the US, it would be the FDA, and they will say, yes, it's fine, you can go to the next stage. And the approval rates for that each stage are very low. And so if you multiply all those kind of success probabilities at each one of those stages, you get to 10% or 5%, I think, success rate overall. So that's kind of like the overview of how it works. And then the problems with that is that, well, for one, there's a scientific problem of how do we even know how to build these molecules, which is right now very artisanal still. But then there's also I guess all sorts of regulatory issues. It's highly regulated space, and you can kind of quibble about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it sort of depends a little bit, but that is sort of kind of the sort of set of issues I think that are plaguing the industry.
I was listening to a chunk of a podcast with Dave Ricks, the CEO of Eli Lilly, the other day, and one of the kind of undercurrents of that was that capital allocation at R&D stage has to happen with big pharma. And one, is that true? And two, I suppose, and I recall one of the conversations that you and I had was around taking a big thing and making it smaller, and that actually the exciting thing in the future is actually the distribution side of drug development. What's going on there? Is he saying that because he's going to say that because he's the CEO of Eli Lilly? And where are the kind of biggest swings in terms of disrupting the kind of quasi-oligopoly in drug discovery and development?
I think it's actually not a quasi-oligopoly. I think it is an oligopoly. And, we haven't really had a new pharma company in 50 years.
You heard it here, folks.
But it's, I think you can't argue that because you can just look at the public big pharma companies. And the reason is just because of that capital, the amount of capital it takes to get a drug to market is just so large that there's only a few players that can really even play that game. And so I think the thing we were talking about last time was about the sort of continued outsourcing of what a pharma company does. So Right now, well, we maybe take a step back. So what pharma companies used to do, they used to own everything end to end. They were doing their own R&D, then they would bring it into the clinical trials end to end, and then they would bring it to market. What's ended up happening because of VC funding, basically, is that you get biotech companies that handle much of this sort of early R&D, and they've been sort of eating in further and further into kind of what the clinical side used to do. So now they go up to phase 2, maybe even phase 3, and they do that themselves. And then pharma will kind of acquire those assets once they have to go to market. And the sort of thing, what we were talking about is like, the exciting thing would be that the clinical development piece actually becomes its own ecosystem over time. I think there's some really cool companies that are working in that space. Ignota Labs is one of them. Some of the friends of Science Machine, I guess. The way that they think about it is we kind of acquire assets sort of cheaply when they're very early, and then we sort of flip them and we sell them off to big pharma. And I think that's probably where this is going to go. So it's basically more like a kind of distribution of what the pharma used to do, and they'll handle more of the go-to-market piece, like taking a drug that's then fully approved and then actually bringing it to market.
What's the benefit for the end consumer patient with that extra layer kind of creating that added decentralization?
Yeah, so I guess in theory it should be prices, right? Because you would have more specialized players, which means that each one of them are much better and more effective. So right now, one of the problems is with biotech companies is that when they decide to go into the clinic, they basically have to completely restructure the whole company. So in early R&D, the type of talent you need and the type of infrastructure you need is like very different from the clinic. So in early R&D, you'll have internal labs, you'll have people in the wet lab, they'll kind of work in Petri dishes or they work on animals. The expertise there is like really about sort of early discovery, understanding biology, understanding chemistry. When you then get in the clinic, it's all about like running this in hospitals and kind of a lot of logistics, a lot of project management. And you don't really need the wet lab anymore unless you have other programs that you want to do. Many times they do those kind of on the side as well as like hedging bets. But essentially the company becomes like a whole different beast once you get in the clinic. And so that to me feels like a massive inefficiency for a company. Really, you'd want to have biotech companies that really focus just on the science, on like developing those assets kind of in the early stage. And then they out-license them to like specialized clinical development companies that flip them. I think Roivant is another very exciting example that did that very successfully. I think also like around sort of neglected assets from big pharma as well. It makes sense to kind of specialize because they're very different beasts, those different stages. And so from the end consumer point of view, to answer your question, that should make things more efficient and effective and therefore cheaper.
I was thinking about the fact that the early days of the Royal Society saw scientists creating their own hardware, essentially. And we were talking to a couple of guys the other day who were very early looking at kind of creating GPUs for biology, kind of what happens when you focus on industrializing computational biology.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about kind of disaggregating the kind of market as a whole, but are there areas early on where actually a more full stack approach could be helpful to scientists?
Yeah, I mean, I guess our bet as Science Machine is that is not the case, because like what we're trying to do is disaggregate as well, in that we're kind of trying to provide. So also just a bit about where our idea comes from is actually that when I was working in these drug discovery companies, it was basically they were doing drug discovery, that was like their business model, but they were spending a lot of capex on like developing a computational platform, and I actually believe that probably is not where they should be spending their money. Like personally, I believe that the biotech companies should focus on the science. They should be really excellent at like specific disease areas and like really solving that particular problem and, leaning into their business model. And then we can basically focus on the computational aspect of like, okay, how can we build a really great computational platform for every biotech company or, most biotech companies. That being said, I think there will be full stack plays that make sense for sure as well. But I think there will be the exception because of the capital requirement.
I think what's just sort of to tie those together, what's interesting is this kind of being in the foothills of the outsourcing and creation of new kinds of hardware. There's a world in which that stuff is outsourced. So I think it's very much feels like a more the merrier at the moment because of there being so many kind of barriers to scientists being able to crack on.
Just to say on full stack, I think there will be big players in full stack. I think it's just a bit of a luxury type of startup, as in like the person who founds it needs to already have a lot of clout, because the amount of capital you need to be able to do that is a lot. So I think like Lila Sciences, for example, is super exciting. isomorphic, obviously, I think makes a lot of sense. So there will be big winners there, but you need to basically, as a founder, I think you probably will need to be already like fairly well established to do that.
My colleague was speaking to someone the other day who is synthesizing human breast milk. It feels like there's a lot of increasingly sophisticated work being done with stem cells, but that we haven't got to a point of industrializing that. What would it take for us to industrialize human biology, and what might some of the benefits of doing that be?
The main thing would be about reducing the cost of bioreactor manufacturing, like manufacturing of these cells. So for cell therapies where you'd use stem cells, I think one of the big challenges has just been cost of manufacturing. It also is sort of like, as always, depends a little bit on the context. For the breast milk case, I can't really say exactly what the bottleneck would be there. For cell therapies, there's also sort of, I suppose, issues around if they would be rejected by the host, for example, if there's, like, how do you make sure that the immune system doesn't react to it, for example.
If you had a magic wand, what would the single greatest thing we could solve be?
I think the magic wand would probably be it's just about how do we increase the probability of success in clinical trials, and in particular at phase 2, where the failure rate is super high, where already a lot of money is invested. And I think there's also people doing really interesting work in that space around how do we design better clinical trials, for example. But yeah, I think personally that would be like the main thing. How can we predict success of clinical trials as early as possible?
Can you explain to everyone what it looks like for scientists, bioinformaticians currently on the ground in terms of how siloed their work is versus someone else who might be working on something really similar?
You have the scientists, you have the bioinformaticians, and they, wet and dry lab. And they usually work in some sort of loop where the scientists go, they do an experiment, they collect the data, they send it over to the dry lab, and the dry lab does the analysis and then comes back with results. Then they have some follow-up questions, and it kind of goes in a loop like that. I think the issue is a lot around also just language. So the scientists and the bioinformaticians speak slightly different languages many times, especially because bioinformaticians can be from a mathematics background or a computer science background. And so there's a lot of kind of miscommunication, slow sort of turnaround cycles where they ask a question, takes 2 weeks to get an answer, they misunderstood it slightly, they kind of have to follow up and go back to them as well. So this is even just sort of in a microcosm of like a small biotech company. In big pharma companies, this is sort of magnified 1,000-fold because the organizations are way further apart and they kind of communicate via many different layers of management. So I think that's kind of the siloing sort of between those two groups of people. And then there's like all sorts of siloing in these organizations as well. They will maybe even have done the same experiment, but they wouldn't even know that they have.
So with that context, what does it look like when you succeeded?
So I think that we will have succeeded when basically every scientist has on their benchtop a research assistant that can answer their questions immediately and also already intuit what the follow-up question would be and other interesting research avenues that they haven't even thought of. So basically like a full-blown kind of data science team at their fingertips.
We haven't talked about Sam yet. You're AI data scientist, so the product that you have developed. How are people using Sam today?
So the way that the people are using Sam is kind of there's 3 big buckets, I think. On the one end, there's the sort of question answering that I mentioned, which is just you put in some data, you have a question, it comes back with a report. It's more trying to understand like the science of it. The second bucket is actually one that we're quite excited by, which is automating the building of AI models in biology itself. So using AI to build AI. The way that works is like the company will have collected some data and they basically want to train a model to optimize a process. So for example, they'd want to classify images of different cancer patients and they want to classify what type of cancer it is, for example. Then the third bucket is processing raw data. So there are CROs out there, they generate data for clients and they generate a lot of data. And there's a lot of manual work still going on around like how do they process that raw data to then present it to their clients. And that's also where we can help automate a lot of that work as well.
Especially for bucket 2, is there a world in which there is a kind of common good to science in the future? Like, is there crossover between organizations? People will sit and hear you saying that and just be like, well, it kind of makes sense for one organization to share with another and IP be damned and competitive advantage be damned because there's a common good to the whole thing. Is there a world in which we can achieve that?
Yeah, so I think that's already happening actually. So you have companies like Harriet who are basically building what they call federated learning platforms, where these different companies can share data with each other without the data actually leaving their environments. And so then they train models kind of across those organizations. I think the project is called OpenFold, actually. So they're trying to replicate AlphaFold, but across those different organizations. Yeah.
That's really cool. Okay, that makes me feel happy about the world. What would be the most exciting thing that somebody could build in your field right now that isn't Science Machine?
The most exciting thing that I can think of is probably a sort of end-to-end automated system with lab robotics and sort of an AI scientist that can optimize cell-based assays automatically. This is something that takes usually like weeks or even months or years for people to do, and often they do it in academia, and then they use that as like a pretext to spin out. And if you could do that automatically, it would be mind-blowing.
Changing topic completely, one of the longer write-ups about you and Lorenzo, who's the CEO of Science Machine, was lauding the fact that you managed to build an incredibly robust startup with just the two of you. Could you just walk people through the details of that, what it looked like, and why it was so effective? Because I think we sort of went one-person unicorn or two-person unicorn. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, we're not quite at unicorn status yet.
But you're working on it.
Working on it, yeah. The way that we managed to make that work was obviously a lot of sort of AI automation, of course, but I think a big piece of it is just about prioritization, focusing on the right things more than anything else. When you have raised some capital, the risk is so high that you start hiring people and that you kind of end up doing a million things at once. We've been always like very deliberate about, we just want to do this one thing and we want to do it really well, and we're like very clear about that.
Let's talk about funding. I think everybody knows a little bit about how fraught funding for science is and funding for researchers, and the fact that so much gets determined in a kind of round peg square hole sort of way, so that people aren't free to kind of take an ARC Institute approach to the work that they do. How can we inculcate more radical change in funding research and what that looks like? And is it something that concerns you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people doing good work in that space. People thinking about, these focused research organizations or FROs. There's a bunch kind of in the US. It's like quite an exciting new space. That being said, though, many of those end up kind of flipping for profit at some point because there's just not enough capital there either. I probably will have an unsatisfying answer here, is that I don't know what the best route forward is. I think the reality is that sort of for-profit is just such a good motive, and capitalism just is so good at allocating capital generally, that probably that is kind of the way forward still, just sort of venture capital-backed startups. Biotech has just been through a very tough few years. They've just not been funded pretty much at all, unless they had some sort of AI angle now, which I actually have some opinions on that, whether that's a good thing. But I think that will probably turn around at some point again. In terms of like academic funding, I think academic funding to me feels like fairly flawed, but I'm not an expert in that because I've never done like a PhD and never written a grant. But it to me feels like the incentives are not quite aligned on like producing the best type of science. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have like a great answer for you there.
It feels a bit like if we go down a layer, so we're not thinking necessarily about inflows of funding per se, but the organizations into which those pots of money flow. I suppose you could make the argument that we're in a kind of relatively evolved state of, say, someone who's making a big philanthropic donation, doing so into an institution that has strictures and guardrails around how that money can be presented, deployed, etc. And that's where you get the kind of pigeonholing of research. I don't know, if you have any thoughts on that, but obviously, there's sort of two different worlds here to some extent, academic versus the work that is done within profit-making outfits.
I think the challenge is just time horizons until profit, right? And so kind of that's why you need the philanthropy right now. I think there's like people who have been doing a lot of like good thinking on this sort of stuff. There's obviously, the guys at Future House that do sort of an FRO. And Sam Rodriguez himself has been sort of involved in various FROs. You have one of our investors, Jenny from Juniper, who thinks a lot about alternative routes of funding, especially for things that are not clearly commercializable immediately. I think the reality is, though, that it's probably a thing that has to run for a certain amount of time until you see that there is a route to commercialization. I mean, OpenAI was a non-profit, I guess. They had to flip because they realized the amount of capital they needed was just not going to be enough through the philanthropy. I feel like that there ought to be a way by which you can sort of fund things that are very long running, very long time horizon. But it's hard to see how that would work in like a VC context, especially with biotech where it's like very structured and standardized because of the sort of clinical trial pipeline.
Do you think about the way in which Science Machine might be able to kind of flip that from the bottom up? If somebody has a research assistant and that condenses the time for them to find answers, if you like, for want of putting it in a more precise way, like does that augment the way that you can think about like density and scale in kind of coming up with new things and getting to a point where people can make a return?
Absolutely. I think all the sort of AI scientist projects, which we are one of, basically promise that at its heart. You sort of massively accelerate the sort of experimental cycles, the number of experiments you can do, and the amount of science you can understand at any given time. And that should, in theory, then shorten the cycles until next breakthroughs significantly. And so, like you said, maybe then it would all be VC backable.
We have spoken before about creating a world where there are more scientists. Reducing barriers to entry isn't about lowering standards. It's about that democratization piece and also having more people in the field, not who are coming in unqualified, but who are able to come in qualified and find that there is a bench for them to be at.
Yeah.
What are the implications in your mind then for how we teach children and also messaging around education?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think my take on education is that it's kind of a mess at the moment. Like, I didn't like school at all. I thought university was mostly a waste of time as well.
Another person who thinks it's all a scam.
I think it's pretty close to that, yes. I don't think it's fully university isn't fully a scam because it's badge collecting, so you're basically getting accredited.
The credentialism still counts or something.
Basically, to basically, go to interview and get interviewed, basically get to job interviews. And obviously there's a bit of like a kind of network aspect to it, which is also helpful. But everything apart from that, in terms of the education itself, is a waste of time. I studied biochemistry and then I did a master's in computational biology, but I would say like the things that I'm using now, I learned basically all of it on the job or even now just as a founder. So I kind of wonder a little bit what I spent the last 18 years of my life or 21 years of my life doing in these institutions where I could have maybe done other things and specialized earlier. So like the thing that I'm so bullish about with AI is that you can basically allow people to choose their own curricula. It's sort of infinitely scalable in that way. And so people could just go down whatever rabbit hole they want to. And I think that's great. I think we should have more of that. Going back to our specialization point in biotech, I think specialization is a good thing. If we can do that with kids earlier, I think that would be a very good thing.
We've had a long run of one being told that don't become a plumber because the robots are going to take that.
Yeah.
Become a knowledge worker instead. So we've sort of been, I think, are now getting heavily disabused of that because it turns out that the robots are doing the knowledge work.
Yeah.
But also with white collar work and its evolution, we got a lot of generalists.
Yeah.
And I think it possibly inhibited people's ability to find out how they best learn new things and continue to do that throughout their lifetimes as well. And the wonderful thing about having a tool at your fingertips that you can converse with means that you kind of reignite some kind of pedagogy that you might have kind of lost touch with as well.
I think actually with the plumber example, it's actually a little bit like more demeaning than what you made out to be, which was about, are you going to get replaced? I think it was more just like a status
It was
thing,
also that,
where it was
big fat middle class.
Yeah, you should
thing.
not become a plumber because you want to be in like a fancy office or something like that. And yeah, the irony is that is probably going to go first. From my point of view, school is probably mostly a waste of time.
So what's the message to people? There are like important messages to send out to kind of people who are 10 years behind you, but also to their parents, because it still feels like there's this, as you say, like status messaging around, well, you should go to university and you should do this thing, and the pace of change is vastly outflanking what people are doing.
I mean, I'm always hesitant to give people advice because, like, at the end of the day, like, they need to figure out for themselves. What I did is I went to school, went to university, did all the standard things. In retrospect, I can say that I would have liked not to do those things probably, or not as much of it.
So what would you have said to yourself 10 years ago?
Well, first of all, learn to code, because I went to do biochemistry instead of, computer science, which is what actually I enjoyed much more and also is much more useful. And then the second thing would have just been like, start stuff like on the side. If I had learned to code, I would have started side projects, I think, in that sort of domain. And the upside on that is basically infinite. I was more like, this is kind of embarrassing, but I was kind of like in the music scene. So I was doing that instead.
Were you?
Yeah.
Oh.
Even though I thought that was fun, I think like the upside to that is like fairly limited unless you, one of the 0.00001%.
Is there a world in which, slightly off the wall question, but is there a world in which we see more percolation down from startups and innovators into education? And I guess another kind of touch point there would be when you think about things like apprenticeships. Yeah. It's always very large, usually state privileged companies that are able to offer those things just because they've got the heft and resource to do it. Do you imagine a world where there's kind of more distributed kind of world of opportunities, if you like, where startups and people at the coalface are more involved in offering things to kids?
I think that's happening already, to be honest, especially if you go to Silicon Valley. I mean, the startup founders get younger and younger there. Next thing you know, VC investors will stand in front of primary school and, wait with a checkbook. We are very open to hiring people who are very young if they are hungry and if they're talented. There's no better time to get them because they, you kind of benefit from that slope. People learn a lot from social media, YouTube, especially, I think, listen to podcasts and all these sorts of things, follow people on X. A lot of that sort of startup kind of tech culture is seeping into some of the younger folks, even like before they go to university. Some of it is a bit cringe, but a lot of it, I think, is positive in terms of the things that they instill.
So you have high hopes for the next generation of builders and capitalists?
Yeah, for those, yes. I thought you were going to say the next generation. I guess this depends a little bit.
We come on to the America question, and I'm only calling it that because I'm shorthanding for the kind of RFK kind of way of thinking about medicine and health. And so we have this very visible spectrum of things going on where medicine is getting far better. We're moving between medicine 2.0 to 3.0 and hyper-personalization. At the same time, we've got kind of the anti-vax brigade, people kind of pushing for this sort of purity against the modern world. And we've got people using the internet and AI to self-diagnose. Do you worry about some of those trends, or do you just see this as par for the course in human behavior and we're heading in the right direction?
I think super interesting, and also something that the biotech kind of community, talks about all the time. There was someone who had a pretty good take on it, is that I think biotech has been way too reactive to RFK overall. And I think that's actually done a lot of damage to the industry in many ways, like the credibility, which it's not like biotech needed that. I think on average, people don't trust pharmaceutical companies very much. RFK is an interesting one. On the one hand, he says some fairly common sense things, right? You should take care of yourself. You should sleep well. You should eat well. You should exercise. These sorts of things are obviously true. Then there's the stuff around the vaccine stuff, which, I think is, I can't really say that I'm on the same page on that front. But then he's also done certain things around changing regulatory regimes in the FDA around cell therapies, which would enable kind of easier go-to-market on that front. So he's a bit of a mixed bag. I think in terms of self-diagnosing and things like that, we're not on the healthcare side, so I know much less on that. But from my understanding, the kind of diagnosis on its own in isolation, many AI models nowadays are actually better than most clinicians on. And I guess that would mean, at least from my point of view, that it's probably better that they're getting diagnosed with AI than just a clinician. That being said, though, I think the problem with the self-diagnosis is a different one in that I can't remember what the syndrome is called, but when you're in medical school, people think they have all sorts of diseases. Whatever disease they're currently studying, they think they have it because they read.
Is it valetudinarianism?
Maybe. I don't know.
I think that's what I have.
Okay. basically you can kind of start thinking you have all these different types of diseases when actually you're fine. And so that's always the real risk with self-diagnosis, I think, more than anything else. I think like the problem with healthcare, and there's like so many problems there, but you have these two economies, right? You have the deflationary economy and the inflationary economy, and they sort of bifurcate on what's important and what's not important, basically. And really it has to do with like kind of where government interference comes in, and healthcare is like one of the biggest ones. I think the real sort of problem there is with everything sort of restriction of supply more than anything else. And so I think AI is the amazing increase in supply that we probably need to help in many ways.
And it can increase supply without compromising safety. That's kind of the holy grail, isn't it?
I suppose the test that people have made, and there's like publications on this, is that actually they're safer than clinicians.
Yeah.
But obviously that is politically fairly potent, so I don't know if that will happen anytime soon.
Where do we need less government?
Well, I mean, you ought to just look at, I guess, the cost lines for, the inflationary economy versus the deflationary one, right? And I think it's sort of self-explanatory from there. At the end of the day, we are in the situation we're in because I think our democracies actually work. So I actually believe that our democracies are functional in that they give us what we're asking for. I think it's just that maybe the things we're asking for are not actually in our own benefit many times.
Turn out to all be the same and quite shit, yeah. Right.
I think that, if you go around the world, it's actually a pretty good place to be. But I think that we're at least in Europe, we're probably staring down the barrel of some pretty tough times in the next decade, I think. Yeah.
It's nice, is changing the subject again, but the Ray Dalio take that if you get an increased alignment between the US and Russia, the kind of weak empire that is suddenly in the spotlight against potentially a more aggressive China is Europe.
Yep.
And that feels like one of those sort of potential curveballs. I don't think Europe has had to be seen as a force in a potentially kind of increasingly bellicose and hostile world. And I think we're still in the very early stages of getting to grips with what that could be.
Well, actually, I think that's externalizing the problem. I think that the Europe's biggest enemy is Europe. I think most people don't realize that we haven't grown the economy in 20 years. Like I basically, my adult life, like my conscious life, I've never experienced economic growth, which is why
probably worth pointing out to people that you're Austrian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although actually, I don't think the UK is in any better spot than
no,
Austria.
But this comes from a position of having sat on all sides of the fence.
Oh yeah, I mean, basically all European countries, including the UK, have exactly had the same growth trajectory since 2008, effectively.
This is what happens if you divorce monetary and fiscal union and you just have debt swimming around one.
Yeah, we could probably talk for hours about the reasons, but essentially like that is like to me the sort of the big thing that we're staring down. And I think all the things we're seeing around immigration or whether inequality is all just in some way a symptom of that fundamental problem of no growth.
Everyone has by default become a socialist because now growth just means government spending. And I think Europe actually spearheaded a lot of that way of thinking that people go, oh, if the government spends money on that thing, that equals growth. It's slightly augmented from the government can spend money in order to promote and engender growth to just government spending money equals growth. And that feels like a really, pretty gloomy place to be actually when the deficit is where it is.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that the deficit again is kind of like a sideshow to growth, in that if we had amazing growth, the deficit wouldn't matter, right? Because like we just outgrow our debt. The problem is that we've had massive increases in deficit, but no growth.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that growth is probably largely an illusion in terms of how we measure it. The bigger the size of the state, the harder it is to pull any meaning from that, because the more regulated and tampered with different industries are, the more of a distorted picture that you're getting. Even
if you just take the current sort of way that we measure growth, which is just GDP, right? If you just take that and you account for inflation, we've had zero. We're basically on the level of 2008, right? So even if you just take that way, like you don't rethink the way that we calculate growth, we haven't grown, right?
Yeah.
So maybe the kind of counter argument would be we are actually not measuring it correctly. We actually have grown. But I think the rise of all these different sort of ideologies or whatever, the kind of general feeling of, I guess, decay is probably because we haven't had growth. I actually believe that growth is all you need, whether in any human organization, if that's a company or a country. I think actually growth is both necessary and sufficient.
Yeah. It's just what it actually means to increase value and whether the pie is fixed or not. Because I think there are many pies and that they all almost immaterially go like this in relation to each other rather than it like, I mean, this is the problem, isn't it, that we talk at degrees of abstraction and figuration about these things. And in an intangible world, it gets increasingly more difficult to say where is the upside and the genuine creation of value. And people feel that, but they feel it in what they're inhibited to do. There is an interesting thing, I think, at the moment, which is this idea that it wouldn't even matter if interest repayments went above the tax base if you could outgrow yourself with, say, superabundant energy. And I would love to believe that, but I think in order to make it completely true, you have to go into an MMT way of thinking, and you have to assume that humans don't find other areas where there is latency, in a trade or in the development of something, that would allow you to inculcate some kind of discrepancy in value. And as soon as you've got that again, you don't just have this kind of fluid world in which if you've got abundant energy, everything goes to zero, and if the cost of labour and resource goes to zero, then suddenly nothing matters, because people will always find areas where there is an information asymmetry they can capitalise on. But I think it would be a very exciting thing to live through, seeing that happening and seeing how quickly we can unravel some of the stuff that stops us capitalising on it, and then go, oh wait, what does this new world look like? Ben, thank you so much for coming on. If people want to get in touch or they want to find out more about Science Machine, where can they go? You can go to sciencemachine.ai, and you can reach us on LinkedIn and our email, which is ben@sciencemachine.ai. Thank you so much. Thank you.